Welcome to Savannah Tree Foundation's Tree Talk series. This is State of the Trees 2020 Canopy Assessment. First, I want to say that for anybody who watched this live, this is not going to look quite the same. We had a bit of a technical issue with the upload of the recording. So Jake and I are re-recording this. And luckily we did capture all the questions that the participants had during this event. So we'll address those questions as well. So sorry for the technical bug. This is our first webinar, so we appreciate your patience as we kind of get through all this. That said, we're going to jump in. Welcome, my name is Zoe Rinker. I'm the Executive Director of the Savannah Tree Foundation. And on behalf of our staff and our board, I want to thank you for joining us today for the first of an 8-part series called Tree Talks. We are bringing together local experts to talk about our local trees once a month between now and April 2021. Big thanks to Georgia Power and to Mark and Pat Suen for sponsoring this series, and can't wait to bring you this and many more talks to come. So for those who might not be familiar, we are Savannah Tree Foundation. We are a 38-year-old organization here in Chatham County with a mission of protecting and growing our urban forest through tree planting, community engagement, and advocacy. We have planted over 4,000 trees in our 38 years and have focused on really planting the trees of tomorrow while also protecting the trees we currently have. For those of you who may be familiar with us, you may notice that we're looking a little different these days. We've recently updated our logo, our tagline, and our mission statement to kind of better reflect how our trees, our community, our work, and our future are all intertwined and kind of the direction we're going as an organization. All right, and as for who we are a staff of 2 full-time and a couple part-time admins. I'm Zoe Rinker, I'm Executive Director, as I've said, and we have Jake Henry, who is our field manager, and Jake will be taking over the Canopy Assessment analysis portion of this talk, and then I'll circle back to talk a little bit more about the larger implications. And we will be addressing all questions at the end. So we'll finish up with a little bit of a Q&A from our participants. So Jake has been with the foundation 2 years. He has a master's from University of Mississippi State University in forestry, and is also a certified arborist. You'll find him around town doing all of our planting and educational programming for Savannah Tree Foundation, and he also spearheaded this Canopy Assessment over the summer. So without further ado, here is Jake.
All righty, thank you so much, Zoe. So I am super excited to present this Canopy information today. The first thing I wanted to talk about is why we're even doing this. Why are we doing a Canopy Assessment? Why is this important? And what is a canopy? So typically when we refer to a canopy, we're talking about the mature tree species in an area, and it's basically that highest level of trees, forest, in an urban forest. And we really use this as a metric for a lot of reasons. So one of the main things is just to track the tree loss and gain across the county. It really informs our planting efforts. So we always want to be planting in areas of need, really trying to replace lost canopy. And it also helps with our advocacy efforts. So this is a really important tool to know where we're losing trees and why we're losing trees. So that's really one of the key points there. And to understand the impacts on our urban forest. So it really helps us understand the things that we do and how they impact our urban forest, particularly development, tree ordinances, climate change. All of these things are impacting our urban forest, and a canopy assessment helps us understand how those things are actually affecting the urban forest. So just a little bit about the process. I won't get too in the weeds here. We essentially used a couple different computer programs and satellite imagery, which is the key there. It's really amazing what we can do in this day and age with technology. So the satellite imagery is publicly available, it's free. The Landsat 8 is the name of the satellite, if you're curious. Now this is 30-meter resolution. So what that means is each pixel is a 30 by 30 meter. And that has pros and cons, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But essentially that's the base imagery that we used. And here's the image of Chatham County. And what we do essentially is we take that image and transform it in a couple different ways. So there's one here and another one here. Essentially, it just displays certain features differently. And what this allows us to do is train an algorithm to pick out different cover classes. Now, when I say cover classes, I mean, what is the actual cover on the land? Is it water? Is it marsh? Is it vegetation? Is it an urban cover class? I'll talk a little bit about more about those in a minute. But essentially, we're training an algorithm to learn how to pick those out by using these different transformations here. And then once we have trained the algorithm, we can expand that tool to the entire county. So we don't have to, go point by point and tell it what it is. It learns, it figures it out. And what we end up with is this really incredible map here. So this is super cool. I'm going to talk more about it in a second. But this is just such an incredible map and really gives us a lot of information. It might not seem like it right now, but there's a lot of good info packed into here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs that we have to think about when we're doing a canopy assessment, particularly in this way, when we use satellite imagery. So the pros are, it gives us a bird's eye view of all of Chatham County. That's fantastic. It is so hard to survey the entire county on foot or with a drone. It's really only possible with satellite imagery. And it allows us to see the general trends in tree loss and gain. So the large scale changes. Really easy to perform with limited staff and resources. So as Zoe said, we're a staff of full-time 2. We did have an intern that helped us out this summer who was fantastic. But it's, really makes a difference that it's easy to perform. And it's efficient, so pretty cost effective. This is something that we can do yearly and really just kind of track that change on a regular basis. Now, some of the cons are, as I mentioned, 30-meter resolution. You can miss some of the nuance change. A lot of times we'll see maybe just 1 or 2 trees coming out here and there. It's hard to spot those. So we can miss that really fine resolution. And one of the other things I'm going to talk about as well is it's hard to identify the quality of the canopy using satellite imagery. So we'll discuss that a little bit more, but that is one of the shortfalls of this method. It's not useful for tracking large specimen loss. We always hear about these large live oaks that come out downtown. It's always a shame to see them go. But sometimes it's really hard to see that on a satellite image. It's not that apparent. And sometimes the satellite imagery can have little weird inconsistencies. So a good example is if there's a drought, that can affect the color of the vegetation, how it's perceived by the algorithm, and our results ultimately. So there are little alterations we have to be careful of when we use that satellite imagery. But overall, the pros absolutely outweigh the cons. Just an absolutely fantastic tool to be able to use. So here's our 2020 cover classification. So I'm going to walk through these a little bit and talk about what they are and the percentages. And we did just put some outlines on there of the different municipalities, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And you may notice the first cover class here says vegetation. It doesn't say canopy. So again, one of the limitations of the satellite imagery assessment is it can be a little difficult to tell if it's actual tree canopy or if it's low growth vegetation, kind of shorter stuff. So that's one of the areas that we have to be careful of, and we're going to talk a little bit more about in terms of quality versus quantity. But I did want to make that note. So our vegetation cover class is at 41% of Chatham County. Marsh is 23%. It's a nice chunk of the county. We've got quite a bit of marshland here. 16% is water, also a lot of water. And urban is 10%. Now, urban means a few different things. So these are essentially impermeable surfaces. So the top of a building, a road, a parking lot, sidewalks, those sort of things appear as urban surfaces. So that's 10%. And then the last 10% is bare soil. So Bare soil is primarily these pre-construction areas where vegetation, forested area is sort of pulled away and it's just bare soil. And usually this is right before construction areas. So this makes up our cover class of Chatham County. And I'm going to delve into what this actually means, especially historically, how these trends have changed over time. But when we look at the individual municipalities, there's some interesting numbers here. One of the main things that I wanted to stress with these numbers is there's no magic canopy percentage number. It really varies place by place. One of the best examples is Tybee Island. So Tybee on this map has 15% vegetation as of 2020. And that might seem really low, but Tybee doesn't have that much plantable space. There's a lot of marshland within Tybee's boundary. So that's not necessarily a bad number. When we look in comparison at Vernonburg or Bloomingdale with 83%, much higher canopy numbers, that's more appropriate for their area just based on the topography. So again, there's no magic number, but we are going to look at trends for Chatham County because that does give us some information. We can compare to our past selves. So looking at 2014 to 2020 canopy change, we've got some changes in vegetation here. And I picked 2014 because the Tree Foundation had actually commissioned another canopy assessment back in 2014. And these numbers are actually with our methods. We compared, they line up, so that's great. We did it right. So this is just a useful metric for us to compare how things have changed over the last 6 years. Now you can see many of the municipalities actually gained vegetation. Some had essentially no change, such as Bloomingdale or Pooler, but overall there was a 7% gain in vegetation. Now, I do want to make a note, some of these municipalities might seem really extreme. Thunderbolt gained 14%. Thunderbolt's also very small. So a small change in vegetation, they gained about 140 acres, leads to 14% increase. So it is important to consider the overall acreage of a municipality when you look at them in that way. But overall, we did see an increase. And again, I'm going to talk about what that increase actually was, because the vegetation can mean a couple different things. So where was it gained? Well, one of the areas that we saw the most vegetation gain was previously bare soil in 2014. So that means it was some kind of bare soil. It was pre-construction or the edges of a construction area, and it just grew back on its own naturally. And that's where we got vegetation. Now, it's really important to remember that 6 years of growth is not a large live oak. Most of the live oaks we see downtown are 100, 150 years old. You really can't get significant canopy in 6 years. It's just not possible. So we have to think about, well, what kind of vegetation actually grew back in that 6 years? And when we think about this long-term trend, it's really important to think as far back as we can. So there was a canopy assessment that was performed in 1993, I believe, and it estimated that Chatham County had 50% canopy cover, which is fantastic. Over the years, it declined, all the way up to our 2014 assessment, where it was down to 36% canopy. And now we're back up to 41. So that's a good thing. We're on the upswing, but we still have a long way to go. We can improve so much more. We could surpass the 50% canopy, but it really depends on what kind of canopy we're actually replacing with. So I did want to discuss the areas of tree loss. Even though we did have an overall gain, it's so important to understand that lost canopy is different than the regained canopy. If we're regrowing low, sort of scrubby, unmanaged vegetation, a lot of what we're losing is healthy, mature canopy, and that takes a long time to replace. So you can see here on this map, this is areas that were previously vegetation in 2014, and now in 2020, there's something else. So primarily what you'll see is the purple, which is now urban, or yellow, which is bare soil. And those two cover classes were previously vegetation in 2014. And really what we can see here is a lot of that vegetation loss was concentrated in the western part of the county. Now this is something that many of you say, well, yes, we know, we're aware of all that loss out there, but it's important to have the actual information here. This is the actual satellite imagery. This is the data showing us that this is where vegetation was actually lost in that 6 years. And one thing I did want to mention here, a question that we get frequently is, what was the effect of Hurricane Matthew? Obviously, it was a devastating hurricane, caused lots of tree failure across the county. And that's something that's actually pretty difficult to see on a map like this. As I mentioned earlier, tracking those individual tree changes is a little difficult with the resolution that we have available. It's usually easier to see large swaths that are removed. So whether it be development or maybe a tornado, that would be more apparent here. But Matthew had lots of little impacts across the county, so it's not quite as visible here. But there is one factor that shows us pretty well where loss actually happens, especially pertaining to development of new urban areas. When we look at the municipality map here, we can see areas that either have no tree ordinance or a poor tree ordinance have significant areas of development. So when we look at Pooler here in pink, lots of new development happened there. Port Wentworth to the north has experienced quite a bit of development, and adjacent to that is the unincorporated county. Bloomingdale also has lots of development. So these are areas that either have no tree ordinance, such as Bloomingdale or Port Wentworth, or a tree ordinance that isn't very strong or isn't enforced very well. So this is really important to consider when we're thinking about how we can advocate for protection of trees, mitigating tree loss, and how the laws and the ordinances actually affect that. And this is just a really cool figure I like a lot. We can see really well large-scale development with this satellite imagery. So from 2014 to 2020, again, similar to that map we just saw, this shows vegetation loss and what the new cover class is. And you can see these buildings almost perfectly outlined. You know, that surrounding space is still vegetated, but these new buildings are clear as day here. So this is a really great tool to show us where there's new development, especially when it comes to these large buildings that are developed like these. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, quantity versus quality. Quantity is what we got essentially in the last 6 years. We got 7% vegetation gain. That's good. We do want green space. We do want to be recovering, but we're not getting quality. A lot of what we're seeing is here. This is an example. This is a sort of an abandoned parking lot that is just left to regrow. It's no longer being managed. A lot of that canopy that's growing up there isn't really quality canopy. You know, this is probably a lot of invasive species, maybe less desirable species, and can be really difficult to manage if these are just let go. Whereas what we would like is quality canopy. So this is Juliette Low Park over in the Gordonston neighborhood, a beautiful park, fantastic tree canopy here. Many of these trees are 50 to 100 years old and really just provide some fantastic shade, lots of incredible environmental benefits here. And this is the kind of canopy that we really want to be regrowing, not just areas that are left to regrow naturally. We want some intent and some quality down the road. And as I mentioned, it takes time. It's really easy to lose that canopy. It can take, you know, just a couple years to clear out those wide swaths of land, and it can take another 50 to 100 years to get back to a quality canopy like this. So just to sort of recap on some of the major takeaways that we have here, while we've gained quantity, we've lost quality. Again, it's so easy to lose those really high quality canopies, and it just takes such a long time to grow them back. And you can see that again, thinking about that map that showed where we don't have a good ordinance or an ordinance at all, and where we're seeing lots of impacts of development and clear cutting out in that part of the county. And most of that clear cutting is associated with industrial construction. So as I mentioned, you're not going to see a lot of those tiny little losses, but these large scale deforestation activities you are seeing through the satellite imagery. So it's really just a drastic effect, and it is having the most noticeable impact on our canopy when we talk about losses. So what is the actual state of the trees? You know, where do we go from here? How do we process information, and what do we use it for? Well, Zoe's going to talk about that. So I'm going to pass that off to her and let her talk about the actual state of the trees here in Chatham County.
Thanks, Jake, and thanks for that analysis of the Canopy Assessment. It's a lot of great data to work off of. So the question is, what is the state of the trees in Chatham County? And the simplest answer is precarious. We've gained some tree canopy in the last 6 years, but as we've talked about, it's quantity, not quality, and so we're losing a lot of larger trees. Anecdotally, we know we're losing some large live oaks to storms, to development. And so we need to be thinking longer term about what our tree canopy is going to be looking like in the next 10, 20, 40, 50 years. So in that kind of vein of thinking, here are the challenges that we're facing as a community and as an organization. So we have regional growth, mostly a lot of industrial construction around the ports. We have an aging tree canopy, especially in Savannah. Globalization has led to increased occurrences of pests and disease, and we are a coastal community dealing with the effects of climate change. So to delve into each one of these a little bit more, Chatham County's population has grown almost 10% in the last 10 years. That means a lot more residential construction, a lot of large neighborhoods in Western Chatham County. And at the same time, we've also had a huge boom in industrial space. The port is looking to double its size, and that trend will only be continuing. But we have about 5 million square feet of industrial space under construction right now, which will add to an already 74 million square feet built to date. So, but the best way to combat that is to really it's back to the tree ordinances. I mean, we can't emphasize it enough. So we need to be advocating for strong tree ordinances across all municipalities and working towards, preferably the ordinances that have similar strength and similar context and regulations, so that it's easier for developers to work across municipalities. But we need to make sure that those ordinances have some teeth, and that the teams that are tasked with enforcing them have the funding and the manpower that they need to enforce them and to ensure developers are held accountable. So that's a major priority for us advocating in our advocacy efforts, is working with our partners in the municipalities to ensure that the tree ordinances are strong. For example, in Pooler, we're working with City Council there right now to improve their tree ordinance, but then to ensure that they are enforceable and enforced. So that's going to be a major challenge as we move forward. Another major challenge is an aging tree canopy, especially in downtown Savannah. So many of the tree canopy that we love in downtown Savannah was planted in the 1890s and early 1900s. Most urban live oaks live to be about 150 years old, and that means they're going to age out in around 2040 or in the coming years. And so a lot of these trees were planted in response to a series of hurricanes that happened in the late 1800s. Live oaks were planted because they were kind of seen as more resilient to hurricanes, but that doesn't mean they're invincible. And so as they start aging, there's been impacts of the urban environment on them. You're going to see more and more trees starting to have structural issues and have to be taken out. We're seeing kind of an uptick in this throughout the city. I know one on Liberty just got marked to come out. So this is just a function of this aging tree canopy. So what can we do about it? Really, it's coming a plan. There's only so much we can combat nature, so the best move here is to think about how we're gonna protect the trees we have to the extent we can, and what we're gonna plant and when we're gonna plant it in order to continue our tree canopy. So that means thinking creatively about places to plant downtown. It means working with the government, especially the greenscapes, to ensure that they have the plan for how they're going to replant. But it means, starting to plant now and not waiting for trees to come down. And so really forward thinking and not being reactive. As an organization specifically, we're working on a tree lawn reclamation program to take tree lawns that have been lost to development or maybe were never created, and to reclaim them, put trees in, and start growing trees now that can then maybe, start moving towards a continuous tree canopy in the downtown area specifically. We're super excited to be working with Downtown Garden Club in November to be reclaiming Drayton and Liberty, the corner of Drayton Liberty. We are doing a series of tree lawns along Drayton. So that's hopefully the first of many tree lawn reclamation projects. So another problem we're facing, the first two were pretty, local issues, and that we can control some of it. The second two are more global issues. And so we really need to have plans on how we're going to react to these forces really beyond our control. So one of the first things here is pests and disease. We are a port city. Globalization in general means that pests and disease travel quicker and further. And that's just compounded by the fact that we receive shipments from all over the world every day, and pests can easily sneak into those big cargo ships. Some of you may have heard, that we've already, the South has been facing a sugarberry tree issue, and there's been major die-off. Savannah's already lost over 1,000 sugarberry trees to really something that we don't understand yet. That's just one example of how specific species can be targeted by something that, maybe we don't know how to stop. More recently, the Asian longhorn beetle was found in South Carolina in Charleston. And that is a pest that has decimated forests in the north, and is really something we're keeping an eye on as we move forward. But these are just two examples of potential issues that threaten our urban forest. And really the best way to deal with this is to think about diversity in our planting, and to ensure that we're planting diverse species as we do our plantings, and to encourage our municipal partners to do the same. So that means that if there is something that threatens the sugarberries, for example, we're not losing entire blocks of canopy at a time, that we can kind of mitigate that by having different ages and different species on that block, so that maybe one is more resilient to a specific disease than others. We're also looking to educate our community on what to look for when we're identifying pests and diseases, and trying to get that information out, so that really the best way to be able to combat a lot of these things is information, and knowing and tracking where there are outbreaks can help the researchers and Georgia Forestry Commission really track and try and get a handle on these pests and diseases. But this is just something we have to keep an eye out for. In general, we've been spared diseases like that, or pests like the emerald ash borer, but that's something that's always in the back of our minds as something that's possible down here. So the final, major challenge we have is the impact of climate change. Trees play a big role in both the being affected by and affecting climate change. So area sea levels at Fort Pulaski have risen 11 inches since 1950. And that means that we're getting a lot of saltwater intrusion in our coastal forests, which means the salt has come into the water table and the trees are absorbing it in their roots. That causes die-off in the trees. You'll see it in our coastal barrier islands with what we call ghost forests. They're white, leafless kind of skeletons of trees. You're going to start seeing more of that as the seawater continues to encroach. But on the flip side, you're also going to see more flooding. because the water table is already relatively high. And so that can also have, detriment to our trees as well. On the flip side, we're also seeing more hot days, which is messing with our growing season, and also, dangerous to humans. We're looking at an estimated 81 days above 105 degrees Fahrenheit by 2030. So the interesting thing about climate change, though, is that trees are also part of the solution to mitigating the short-term and long-term problems that you face with climate change. So what we're doing is planting the right trees that can deal with a little bit of saltwater intrusion, that can really absorb stormwater, and hopefully plant those in strategic places that help mitigate the flood impacts from increased sea levels. These trees also clean and cool the air. You provide the short-term benefits against heat with shade, and the longer-term benefits with sequestering carbon as they produce oxygen, and really absorbing some of the more dangerous agents in our air. And so, the way we kind of deal with this potential threat to our coast is to really just embrace the natural trees and really embrace tree planting as a solution to some of these issues, both long-term and short-term. So there's a lot. There's a lot that we threw at you. We hope that this is kind of helpful, giving you a big picture of where we are in Chatham County with our trees and what we need to do. If you're asking how can you help, really the biggest thing you can do is let your elected officials know that you care about our trees and you want it to be a policy priority. We've mentioned a couple times, we're a staff of 2. We would love to be at every single municipal meeting, all 9 of them across the city or across the county. But it's tough. So if we can have a groundswell of support from people like you who care about trees and who really are worried about the state of our trees, that really helps us try and get in front, get our cause in front of the right people. Other things you can do, you can sign up to volunteer with Savannah Tree Foundation. We have a series of education and planting events coming up this fall. So make sure you're subscribed to our email list to learn about all these events. You can donate to Savannah Tree Foundation online. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. All of our work is funded by generous supporters like you, who allow us to do this important work, protecting and growing our urban forest. And finally, just follow us on social media to learn more. We're always updating events, spreading the word about potential pests or potential planting opportunities. So really that's a way to be tuned in with what we're doing and how you can help as needs arise. So at that, we then took questions on the original recording, and Jake is going to read some of the questions and we will attempt to answer them very closely to how we answered them in the recording.
Yes. Okay, great. So yeah, we had some fantastic questions initially. The first one was from Mary Landers. She said, to be clear, you separate marsh from vegetation, so the marsh grass isn't included as vegetation.
And yes, that's correct. So marshland is a very different, what we consider a very different ground cover than vegetation. You can't plant in marshland. It's has its own ecosystem. So for our purposes, we categorize that differently and don't count that in our overall vegetation count. Right.
And this is when actually somebody mentioned this to me in a private message, but I sort of answered it, so we'll just kind of get to it now. This is from Jessica Gorman. She said, I may be jumping ahead of you, but logged in because of reading an article about the dying of the sugarberry trees. Thank you for reading the article. I have a huge one in my yard, the largest one I've ever seen, and I'm pretty sure it's in trouble. Who can I contact to have someone come out and access it / get advice about it? And this is one that I mentioned as part of another question. It's one of my go-to answers is that to call an arborist. Arborists are professionals in their field who will be able to assess your trees in a safe and efficient way. We do have a list of local companies on our website that have certified arborists on staff. So we always encourage calling one of them. You can always get more than one consultation just to make sure you're getting the right estimate for any work that might need to be done. but we always recommend an arborist. Erica asks, will this presentation be available on your website or elsewhere for others to see later? Yes, sometimes with challenges, but yes, it will be available. Okay, here's another one for you, Zoe. I think you answered this one initially. April Martin asks, along the corridors of both I-95 and I-16, the state DOT has been removing trees at an alarming rate for the past few years. Any idea why and how this is going to affect us long-term?
And I said that it was a great question that we've been hearing a lot about in at least our time with the foundation, and surely before that as well. GDOT has decided that trees along highways are safety issues. That's, there's a lot of different point of views on that, and we obviously have a different one, but that is the current theory of GDOT powers that be. We have tried a lot, and other organizations in, Georgia Forestry Commission, Georgia Tree Council, there's a lot of other organizations that have expressed this concern. Our biggest concern at this point is that there is no forester on staff at the Georgia Department of Transportation. They have arborists that come in and approve specific parts of the project, but there's no one looking at it holistically. Because you're gonna see it's a linear forest that they have a charge over, but it's a large portion of Georgia that is affected by GDOT roads. And so if they start clear cutting, we're gonna be losing a huge portion of our forests throughout the state. And what you're gonna see, and I think I touched on this in a couple different ways in the original recording, is there's impacts of taking out those trees. And you already see it on, at least I've seen it recently, most recently on southbound 95 towards Jacksonville. You're seeing standing water in the medians of places that used to have forests. And it's because, the water table there is high. Those trees were absorbing a lot of the water that was there, that ecosystem was, and now that they're gone, that water is just gonna be standing water now. And I think when you see major storms come through, that it's gonna be even less able to process that water. So that's gonna be a major issue that I think could have been foreseen if there had been a forester on staff when these plans came to light with GDOT. So that's gonna be a problem. You're also gonna see, they've prided themselves on leaving specimen trees along the medians, meaning they pretty much took live oaks and said they cared about trees because they kept those. But what you're seeing is that these trees all grew in a forest, and so they didn't put a lot of resources into their roots because they were protected by other trees. They put most of their resources into growing tall and getting towards light. And so these actually have really relatively weak root systems, and there's potential that they will actually come down during storms more likely than if it had been, the forest had remained. So there's a lot of issues there. It's a big kind of David versus Goliath problem that we're continuing to keep an eye on and continuing to try to find the right approach to get GDOT to see reason.
Great. All right. Next question is from Jason Buellerman. He says, can you describe the differences between the county and the city of Savannah's tree ordinance? This is one that I answered before. It's a great question. So at one point some years ago, I think the city and the county had the same ordinance, and the city has since added to it. So their ordinance is a little bit more robust, but essentially they use the same point system in terms of development and requiring trees to be replanted. I know the city has added their tree lawn ordinance as a part of it. So that's specific to Savannah and the city of Savannah, and particularly because there are those iconic tree lawns downtown in Savannah, and they're so important to protect. So the county does not have that portion, but really where we see the biggest difference between the two is enforcement. So the city of Savannah has a fantastic greenscapes division who works very hard to protect our resources here in the city. And the county just doesn't have as large a department. They don't have the resources to do as much. And so I think we just see a little bit of lacking enforcement in the county in terms of the ordinance. Okay, next question is from Robin Sherman. They ask, what are you doing to work directly with the City of Savannah, Savannah City Council, and the Savannah Tree Commission? I think you answered that one before.
I did answer this one. So yeah, it's there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to trees in Savannah, but we are in touch with Greenscapes almost on a weekly basis, which is the city division that covers the city's trees. We've been talking with them a lot about potential citizen pruners programs to try and alleviate some of the pressure and the workload from their crews and doing some of the easier work through volunteers. So we're working with them on that. On the council front, we've working with several council people on various projects ranging from Bacon Park Forest to planting along the Truman Linear Trail and making sure that these new linear trails and active paths are able to be used year round by adding street trees or trail trees and making sure that there's shade on those. And we're also working with, we were excited to see that the city manager position called for someone who could see trees as part of see the urban forest and think about urban forest management in their policy work. And so we were really excited to see that and what the council was calling for and the city manager, and we look forward to hopefully working with the new city manager to really come up with this plan that we've discussed needing to happen, especially in the downtown Canopy, really just solidifying some of this in the government and in the regulations.
All right. And another great question from Mary Landers. She asked, can you talk about Savannah's removal of trees following a payout of a big lawsuit from a falling limb injury? Is the city taking out more trees than it did previously? And how have other cities approached this liability issue?
Yeah, and I tackled this one. You know, without having the specific data on tree removals, I can't speak to whether or not we are taking out more trees. I do suspect it may seem like we are, mostly for some of the reasons that we talked about before, and that we now have more aging trees. We have trees that are starting to have structural issues that do need to come out. But from a liability standpoint, there is I know before COVID and the kind of emergency response took front stage back early in the year, the council was considering bringing a request to the state assembly so that they capped their liability and the amount that they needed to pay out on these cases. So Chatham County currently has a cap at, I think, 500,000, and the city currently has no cap. And so really there's a legal issue there that needs to happen with the state government, who can speak to some of those, who can pass regulations on that type of capping and liability issues. And so, you know, we need to have that discussion because obviously it's not sustainable right now, the payouts that we've been having. But the response to that is not to cut down all of our trees. It's to have a long-term maintenance protocol. It's to have a long-term management plan, and it's to make sure that we have the legal structures in place to make sure the payouts are happening in a fair and necessary way, but that are not bankrupting the city as well.
Great. The next question is from Catherine. She says, are there any pests threatening our older downtown live oaks, or is their age alone the major threat? And she had a two-part question actually. And then the second part is, can you give us an idea of the diversity of trees being planted around the city and county, e.g. specific species? So for the first part of that, I answered that there really isn't a major pest affecting the live oaks in the county. You know, trees are always subject to a myriad of pests and diseases. They're constantly fighting off fungi and insects and all these things, but there's really not one particular one affecting live oaks. One of the things I mentioned is that, yes, it's their age, but part of it is that these trees that are downtown are typically at least 100 years old, maybe 150. And if it's hard to think back that far, but those roads that they were planted along were either dirt or brick, very little compaction, very little construction. And in that time, we've put a lot more concrete, a lot more asphalt, more compaction from vehicles, taller buildings. So it's really just become a much more stressful environment. So that really does add to the strain on these aging live oaks in downtown.
So before you go to the second part of the question, I did just want to add something you had said in the previous reporting is that really one of the biggest pests for downtown live oaks are us. It's people.
Yes. It's absolutely human factors that contribute to failure of trees. You look along Victory Drive, so many of those live oak branches have been hit by semi trucks or large trucks. So, we find a lot of these aging trees. Usually it's not a singular cause, but if we cause damage, opens it up to another pest to cause more damage. So it can be these compounding factors on these old trees. For the second part of this question, this is a really great question because this is something I think about a lot. We see tree species planted more and more that are resilient to hurricanes. Obviously, that's people's primary concern here on the coast, thinking about tree species and resilience. That's why we have so many live oaks. That's why crepe myrtles are such a popular urban street tree. In terms of species diversity, you see a lot of those, but there could be so many more. And I think that's really where we try to encourage lots more native tree species that are appropriate. Right tree, right place, make sure you plant the right species. So it is limited, it could be better, really, I think is the answer there. And that's what we strive for. We really try to plant more diverse tree plantings as often as we can. All right. The next question is from Lee. They say, do you think that county land development codes could be revised to be more conducive to minimize impacts associated with growth? For example, stormwater management credits for tree preservation, reduction of parking requirements, greater density and less sprawl?
And I tackled this one, and the short answer is yes. And so, especially on stormwater management, right now, a lot of our funding countywide goes into gray infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, meaning it's built, it's concrete pipes, it's kind of everything you think about when you think of the sewage and stormwater system. Where really, it's a little bit more expensive on the front end, but green stormwater infrastructure, meaning rain gardens, trees planted strategically, that can really cut down on damage costs, cut down on, the breaking of gray infrastructure and all of that. I think there's a lot that can be done to incentivize these creative solutions to stormwater. And I think that goes across the other kind of issues as well. I mean, we recently adopted NUZO. There are definitely places now that the tree ordinances can be changed to better work with NUZO, especially around parking spaces and that type of issue. It's just about making sure that we're thinking about it holistically and thinking about ways and thinking about creatively. And so the short answer is yes, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think if we can take, NUZO past as a first step, and I think it'll be continually under amendment and learning as we go, and we plan to be a part of the process to make sure that some of these lessons learned get incorporated into it from a tree perspective.
Great, thank you. And the next question, Mary Landers again with some fantastic questions here. She asked, do you have a feel for whether homeowners have removed more trees on their property following Hurricanes Irma and Matthew? I know I've seen lots come down around me as a kind of hurricane prep. Maybe the 30-foot resolution wouldn't pick this up. And just quick correction there, we did, it's 30-meter resolution on our imagery, so it's about 120 feet. So, yeah.
And if I remember correctly, Jason Budelman chimed in with that. He had also seen a lot of pines come out.
Yes.
Which is, yeah, so anecdotally, I think we've all seen a lot of trees coming out, especially on private property since the hurricanes. Like Mary said, it's not something that the satellite imagery really would have captured. significantly. And so we can only really rely on our anecdotal evidence at this point. It's definitely a point for further research that we have. But what we're trying to do and to combat that is to really educate the public on how to assess your trees, to see if you think there's any risk or look for signs of risk in your trees. We recently released a hurricane prep guide on our website, along with a video on what an arborist assessment of your trees should look like, and really just trying to give the public as much information as they can to understand that taking all your trees out is not the only way to mitigate risk. And when you do that, you eliminate all the benefits of trees that they have to offer. And so the best way forward is to take a measured and informed approach by having an arborist check out your trees, but also knowing what some of the signs are for potential trees that could come out in the storm. So highly suggest people go over and to our website and check out the hurricane prep guide. And if I remember, Jake, you had a point you added here about Hurricane Matthew and what it took out at the time.
Yeah, so one of the things that we saw with Matthew is that it really took out the weakest trees in the canopy. So we saw a lot of water oaks and laurel oaks come down. Those aren't typically long-lived trees. They can be prone to disease or structural issues. So it's really, after a major storm like that, it's really when you don't want to take out trees, because it's pretty much cleared out the weak ones. So, it's always good to assess, but especially after a major storm like that, it can be sort of a knee-jerk reaction to just cut down trees. So like Zoe said, she had some great points, really just assess if it actually has any risk before you think about cutting one down. Yeah, thank you. And then the last question we had was from Erica, and they asked, so the Savannah tree ordinance does not apply to single-family established residences.
And yes, so the tree ordinance does, in general, not apply to any individual residence, established or even new construction. It doesn't apply to residences under six units, I think, is what it is in the tree ordinance, at least the city tree ordinance. But for the most part, tree ordinances don't deal with individual private property. And that's an issue that we've seen, especially with clear cutting of land around new homes and that type of thing. If it's a bigger development, if it's a commercial development, then yes, a lot of the tree requirements are in place at that point. But when you see something, the only point where it really overlaps, I think, Jake, you made this point before, is that it does deal with tree lawns, which can be adjacent to private property, but are technically public right-of-way. So that's really the extent of how it interacts with the individual private homeowner. But yeah, that's really an issue that we're seeing across the county, and how we're trying to really combat that is to try and get more plantings on public property through seedling and tree giveaways. We're doing a tree sale this fall. So really our goal is to try and educate people to try and not chop down their trees and as a knee-jerk reaction, but also plant more trees for the future. And again, it's also potentially a place that we can think about strengthening the tree ordinance if we really want to get in the weeds on that and try and encourage private homeowners to keep the trees on their property.
Great. All right. Thank you, Zoe. So I think that wrapped up our questions, and we had one last slide that is really exciting. I'm excited for this. Do you want me to talk about our next one, or do you?
Sure, yeah. So I just want to tell everyone to mark their calendars for October 13th. It'll be our next Tree Talks webinar, and this one should be fun. We're going up 60 feet up a tree into the canopy of coastal Georgia with Rob Culte from Save a Tree Savannah, and he's gonna kind of guide us through what's happening up in the canopy. What does the wildlife look like? What does the growth look like? And I think it should be really fun and really fascinating. So mark your calendars, and thank you to everyone who is tuning in, who tuned in live and who's tuning into this recording. again, our apologies for the technical difficulties, but I'm pretty sure we covered everything that we talked about in the live version. So I hope you don't.
Again, if you have any questions, we had our email on the screen, so please feel free to reach out or call.
Yep.
I'm always happy to talk trees.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody, and hope to see you on the 13th.